Mom never trusted you. That's why she left everything to me. My sister Diane said those words beside our mother's grave only 20 minutes after the funeral ended. The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and damp earth. Families around us were quietly saying their goodbyes, gathering flowers, helping elderly relatives toward their cars. But all I could hear was Diane's voice. I stared at her, searching for some sign that she was grieving, some trace of the sister I had known my entire life. Instead, I found calm certainty. She adjusted her black gloves and looked past me as though she had merely commented on the weather. At 68 years old, I thought very little could still surprise me. I had survived losing my husband 7 years earlier. I had survived surgeries, financial hardships, and lonely holidays. But standing there beneath a gray Ohio sky, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that felt like a door quietly closing. I simply nodded. I see, I said. Diane seemed almost disappointed by my reaction. Perhaps she expected tears. Perhaps she expected an argument. She had always enjoyed winning arguments. Even when we were children, she would push and push until someone gave her the reaction she wanted. But I had no energy left for that. Our mother had been gone for only 6 days. The grief still sat heavily in my chest. I turned and walked toward my car without another word. The drive home felt longer than usual. The roads were familiar, yet everything looked different. The coffee shop Mom loved. The church where she volunteered every Christmas. The small bookstore where she used to buy mystery novels by the stack. Every corner held a memory. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at my front porch. My hands rested on the steering wheel, motionless. Diane's words repeated themselves over and over in my mind. Mom never trusted you. It didn't make sense. My mother and I spoke nearly every day. We shared recipes, stories, worries, and family gossip. She called me every Sunday, evening without fail. Just 3 weeks earlier, we had spent an entire afternoon planting flowers in her backyard. She had laughed when we accidentally bought twice as many tulips as we needed. That laugh still echoed in my memory. No. Something about Diane's statement felt wrong, deeply wrong. I finally stepped inside my house. The silence greeted me immediately. I removed my shoes, placed my purse on the kitchen counter, and stared out the window above the sink. Across the yard, a pair of cardinals landed on the fence. Mom always said cardinals were reminders that loved ones never truly left us. I made a cup of coffee, even though it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. The familiar routine steadied my hands. I carried the mug to the dining room and sat alone at the table. That was when I noticed something. During the funeral luncheon earlier that day, Diane had carefully controlled every conversation. She answered questions before I could speak. She redirected topics whenever someone mentioned our mother's finances or estate. At the time, I had blamed it on stress. Now I wasn't so sure. Small memories began connecting themselves in ways they never had before. Missed phone calls, strange comments, documents Mom once mentioned but never showed me. I stared into my coffee until it turned cold. Then I whispered a sentence I never imagined I would say about my own sister. "What are you hiding, Diane?" Outside, the afternoon light slowly faded. Inside, a feeling settled over me that I could not ignore. My sister's betrayal had not begun at the cemetery. It had begun long before our mother died. And for the first time, I was determined to find out how far back the lies truly went. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, something I had done almost every day since my husband passed away. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the sky slowly turn from dark blue to pale gold. Usually, mornings brought me peace. That morning brought questions. The more I thought about the funeral, the more certain I became that Diane's behavior had not been normal. My mother had always been careful, organized, and transparent when it came to family matters. She kept labeled folders for everything. Tax records, insurance policies, property documents, birthday cards from 30 years ago. If she had truly changed her plans regarding her estate, she would have told me. At least that was what I had always believed. Around 8 o'clock, I decided to drive to Mom's house. The property sat about 15 miles outside town on a quiet road lined with maple trees. As I turned into the driveway, the sight of the old white farmhouse made my chest tighten. The flower beds we planted together only weeks earlier were beginning to bloom. Yellow tulips, purple pansies, bright patches of color against the weathered porch. For a moment, I could almost imagine she was still inside, waiting with a fresh pot of coffee and a list of chores for us to tackle together. The front door opened with the same familiar creak. The air inside carried traces of lavender and old books. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. A knitting basket beside her favorite chair, reading glasses on the end table, a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on the kitchen counter. I walked slowly through each room, touching objects that suddenly felt far more important than they had a week earlier. Memories lived everywhere in that house. In the hallway, I paused before a framed photograph of Diane and me as young girls. We could not have been older than 10 and 13. Our arms were around each other. We were smiling so hard our eyes were nearly closed. Looking at that picture, I struggled to connect it with the woman who stood beside the grave yesterday. Back then, Diane had been my protector. If someone teased me at school, she confronted them. If I was afraid during a thunderstorm, she sat beside my bed until I fell asleep. Somewhere along the way, that sister disappeared. Or perhaps I had simply stopped seeing who she really was. As I entered Mom's study, my eyes settled on a filing cabinet beneath the window. The cabinet had always been locked. Mom kept important papers there. I remembered because she often joked that nobody could organize paperwork better than she could. I reached for the handle out of habit. To my surprise, it opened immediately. The top drawer contained neatly arranged folders exactly as expected. Insurance records, utility bills, medical information, everything in perfect order. Yet one thing felt strange. A section labeled estate planning appeared unusually thin. Too thin. I pulled out the folder and placed it on the desk. Inside were only a few documents. Not nearly enough for someone who had spent decades preparing her affairs so carefully. I sat down in her chair and slowly turned each page. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Several document reference numbers skipped entire sequences, as though pages had been removed. Someone had taken files from this folder. And suddenly, for the first time, I began to wonder whether the answers I needed had disappeared long before my mother ever passed away. I remained in my mother's study until the evening light stretched across the hardwood floor. The missing documents sat in front of me like pieces of a puzzle that somebody had deliberately scattered. I checked the folder again, then a third time. The result never changed. Important records were gone, not misplaced, removed. My mother was too careful for this to be an accident. As I closed the folder, I remembered a conversation from nearly 2 years earlier. We had been sitting on her back porch watching a summer storm roll across the fields. She had mentioned meeting with her attorney, Michael Thornton. At the time, I barely paid attention. Estate planning seemed like one of those topics older people discussed simply because they felt responsible. I remembered teasing her that she was probably healthier than both Diane and me combined. She laughed and told me that keeping paperwork organized was her way of protecting the family. The memory returned so clearly that I could almost hear her voice. Protecting the family. Those words stayed with me as I locked the study and headed home. The next morning, I called Michael Thornton's office. His assistant informed me that he was unavailable until the following afternoon. I thanked her and hung up. Waiting was never one of my strengths. But I had no choice. To distract myself, I began sorting through old photo albums stored in my guest room closet. Some dated back more than 50 years. There were photographs of birthdays, graduations, vacations, and family cookouts. In almost every picture, Diane stood near the center, smiling, confident, admired by everyone around her. She always had a way of becoming the person people listened to. Even our parents often relied on her to make decisions. As children, I viewed that as leadership. Looking back, I wondered whether I had mistaken control for leadership all along. Around noon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Grace. My 27-year-old niece had always been thoughtful and observant. Unlike most younger relatives, she regularly visited my mother and asked questions about family history. After exchanging greetings, she hesitated for a moment. "Aunt Evelyn, can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Did Grandma ever tell you she was worried about paperwork disappearing?" The question caught me completely off guard. I sat upright in my chair. "What do you mean?" Grace explained that several months earlier, my mother had mentioned trouble locating copies of financial records. At the time, she assumed she had simply misplaced them. But according to Grace, the missing files continued to bother her. She even joked that important papers seemed to grow legs and walk away. My stomach tightened. This was the second sign pointing in the same direction. Missing documents, missing records, missing explanations. I thanked Grace and ended the call, but my thoughts refused to settle. That night, I barely slept. Every memory seemed to carry new meaning. Every conversation felt worth revisiting. The following afternoon, I arrived at Michael Thornton's office 10 minutes early. His receptionist escorted me into a conference room overlooking the town square. Family photographs decorated one wall. Legal books filled another. When Michael entered, his expression was kind but unusually serious. He shook my hand and sat across from me. Before I could explain why I had come, he opened a file and looked directly into my eyes. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "there are some things about your mother's estate that I have been hoping someone would finally ask about." Michael folded his hands on top of the file and remained silent for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked softly behind him. Outside the conference room window, people crossed the town square carrying shopping bags and cups of coffee, completely unaware that my understanding of my family was about to change. "What do you mean?" I asked. Michael opened the file and carefully removed several documents. "Your mother revised her estate plan 3 years ago," he said. "The changes were significant, but they were never finalized." I frowned. "Never finalized?" He nodded. "She intended to create a new distribution plan, one that treated both daughters equally." My pulse quickened. "Then why was that not the version presented after her passing?" Michael looked uncomfortable. "Because the finalized copy was never completed. Your mother postponed the final signing appointment several times." He slid a document across the table. At the top was my mother's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The rounded letters, the careful spacing, the notes in the margins. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards and grocery lists my entire life. My fingers trembled slightly as I studied the page. There, in black ink, were detailed instructions discussing equal treatment for both daughters and provisions for future grandchildren. Nothing about excluding me, nothing about distrust, nothing that resembled the picture Diane had painted beside the grave. "Mom wrote this?" I asked quietly. "Yes." Michael adjusted his glasses. "In fact, she spent considerable time discussing fairness. She was concerned about preserving family harmony." Family harmony. The phrase landed heavily. If my mother valued harmony so deeply, why had Diane been so eager to create division? Michael reached for another folder. "There is something else." He handed me copies of appointment records. Several meetings had been scheduled over the past 3 years. Some had been completed. Others had been canceled unexpectedly. I examined the dates. A pattern slowly emerged. Nearly every canceled appointment occurred shortly after Diane visited my mother. I felt a chill run through me. It was not proof of anything. Not yet. But it was enough to make me uneasy. Michael leaned back in his chair. "I never suspected wrongdoing," he said carefully. "However, your mother occasionally expressed frustration. She told me certain documents seemed difficult to locate when she needed them. The same concern Grace had mentioned. The same missing records. The same unsettling feeling that pieces of the story had vanished." When our meeting ended, I walked slowly toward the parking lot. The afternoon air felt unusually warm for early spring. I sat inside my car, but did not start the engine. Instead, I reviewed everything I had learned. My mother planned fairness. Important documents disappeared. Meetings were canceled. Diane claimed Mom never trusted me. None of those facts fit together cleanly, yet they pointed in the same direction. As I drove home, another memory surfaced. About a year earlier, my mother called me late one evening. She sounded distracted. She asked whether I had seen a blue folder she thought might be at my house. I told her I had not. The next day she called back and said she had found it. At the time, I forgot about the conversation. Now I wondered if that folder had contained something important. That evening, I called Grace. After listening carefully, she became quiet. Then she said something that made my heart sink. "And Evelyn, there is something I never told anyone. About 6 months ago, I saw Grandma arguing with Diane about a folder, and Grandma looked more upset than I had ever seen her before." Grace's words stayed with me long after our call ended. I sat alone in my living room staring at the dark television screen, replaying the conversation again and again. In all the years I had known my niece, she had never exaggerated anything. If she said she saw an argument, then an argument had happened. The question was why. The following morning, Grace came to my house carrying a cardboard box filled with old photographs and notebooks she had helped organize after my mother's passing. We spread everything across the dining room table. Sunlight poured through the windows as we carefully sorted through decades of family history. At first, we found nothing unusual. Vacation pictures, holiday cards, receipts from home repairs. Then Grace pulled out a small spiral notebook. "This was in Grandma's bedroom drawer," she said. The notebook looked ordinary. The cover was faded blue and several pages were bent at the corners. I opened it without much expectation. Inside, my mother had written reminders, shopping lists, appointment dates, and personal notes. Most entries were mundane. Buy birdseed, call church office, schedule dentist appointment. Then one sentence caught my attention. It was written in darker ink than the surrounding notes. "Need to speak with Michael privately. Diane keeps interfering." I froze. Grace looked up immediately. "What is it?" Without speaking, I turned the notebook toward her. Her eyes widened. We continued searching. A few pages later, another note appeared. This one was dated 8 months earlier. "Cannot find blue folder again. Must make copies." My heart sank. The blue folder. The same folder my mother had once mentioned during that forgotten phone call. Suddenly the memory felt much less ordinary. For the next several hours, Grace and I examined every paper in the box. Most revealed nothing, yet a pattern slowly emerged. My mother had become increasingly concerned about documents during the final years of her life. She made references to missing files, delayed meetings, conversations she needed to have. None of it proved wrongdoing. But together, the notes painted a picture of someone struggling to keep control of important information. Late in the afternoon, Grace discovered an envelope tucked inside an old photo album. It had never been sealed. Inside was a folded sheet of paper in my mother's handwriting. The letter was unfinished. It appeared she had stopped writing midway through a sentence. My eyes moved slowly across the page. She described wanting both daughters treated fairly. She expressed concern that disagreements over money could damage family relationships. Then came a sentence that made my hands shake. "I am beginning to worry that certain decisions are being made without my knowledge." Grace read the line twice. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Inside, the silence felt heavy. For the first time, I realized this situation might be far larger than inheritance. It was about trust. It was about influence. It was about events that may have unfolded quietly for years while everyone else remained unaware. As evening approached, Grace packed the papers back into the box. Before leaving, she hesitated near the front door. "Aunt Evelyn," she said softly, "there is one more thing I remember." I looked up. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "A few weeks before Grandma died, I heard her tell Diane that she was tired of being pressured, and Grandma said if the truth ever came out, the entire family would see things differently." After Grace left, I sat alone at the dining room table long into the night. The unfinished letter remained in front of me, beside the blue notebook. The words seemed heavier each time I read them. Tired of being pressured, decisions being made without my knowledge. If the truth ever came out, the entire family would see things differently. My mother had not been confused. She had not been imagining problems. She had been trying to tell us something. The next morning, I called Michael Thornton again. This time, I asked a different question. "Did my mother ever give you copies of financial records outside her estate file?" There was a brief pause. Then Michael answered, "Actually, yes." My heart immediately began to race. He explained that about 18 months earlier, my mother had requested duplicate copies of several account summaries and property records. According to his notes, she wanted backup documentation stored separately. "Do you know where those copies went?" I asked. "No," he replied. "Your mother picked them up personally." After the call ended, I drove back to the farmhouse. Rain clouds gathered overhead as I unlocked the front door. The house felt different now, less like a place of mourning and more like a place holding secrets. I spent hours searching carefully through closets, cabinets, and storage boxes. I found old recipes, church bulletins, family photographs, and stacks of greeting cards, but no financial records. By late afternoon, frustration began replacing hope. Then I remembered something. Years ago, my father had built a small storage area above the garage. Hardly anyone used it anymore. The narrow staircase creaked as I climbed upward. Dust floated through the air. Old holiday decorations filled most of the space. Several cardboard boxes sat untouched along the back wall. I opened them one by one. Most contained ordinary keepsakes. Then I noticed a metal lockbox hidden beneath a folded blanket. My pulse quickened. The key was not attached. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I remembered the small collection of spare keys my mother kept in a kitchen drawer. 20 minutes later, I found one that fit. The lock clicked open. Inside were folders, dozens of them, neatly organized, carefully labeled, exactly the way my mother handled important records. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I nearly laughed. At last, something had survived. I carried the box downstairs and placed it on the dining room table. For the next several hours, I reviewed document after document. Tax records, property information, investment summaries, insurance policies. Everything appeared normal until I reached a folder labeled transfers. Inside were records spanning nearly 6 years. Several transactions immediately stood out. Funds had been moved between accounts repeatedly. Most transfers were modest. A few were surprisingly large. What caught my attention was not the amounts. It was the authorization notes. On multiple occasions, Diane appeared to have acted as an intermediary during financial discussions. Nothing illegal, nothing obviously improper. Yet her involvement seemed far greater than anyone in the family had ever realized. As evening approached, I organized the papers into separate stacks. Then I noticed a sealed envelope tucked into the back of the folder. Across the front, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made my breath catch. For Evelyn, if questions arise. For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope. The room felt completely still. Outside, rain tapped softly against the farmhouse windows, but inside, all I could hear was my own breathing. My mother had addressed the envelope to me personally, not to both daughters, not to the family, to me. I turned it over carefully. The seal had never been broken. My hands trembled as I opened it and removed the letter inside. The paper was folded twice. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. I sat down at the kitchen table before reading the first line. My dear Evelyn, if you are reading this, then something has happened that concerns you enough to start asking questions. My eyes immediately filled with tears. It felt as though she was sitting across from me once again. I continued reading. She explained that over the last several years, she had become increasingly worried about tension within the family. At first, the concerns seemed small. Misunderstandings, conflicting stories, disagreements about financial matters. But according to her letter, those concerns gradually grew into something she could no longer ignore. She wrote that she often felt pressured to make decisions quickly, pressured to sign papers before she had fully reviewed them, pressured to trust explanations that did not always make sense. Yet the most painful part came next. I know you and Diane have always loved each other, but there are things I have chosen not to tell you because I hoped they would never become important. I stopped reading and closed my eyes. My stomach tightened. The words carried a weight I could not explain. After a few moments, I forced myself to continue. My mother described an incident from nearly 20 years earlier. Shortly before our father passed away, he had attempted to arrange a private meeting with both daughters. The purpose was simple. He wanted to discuss family assets and future responsibilities openly. According to the letter, the meeting never happened. At the time, I believed our father had changed his mind. Diane told me he was too tired and preferred to postpone it. Eventually, the subject disappeared, but my mother's letter revealed something different. My father had not canceled. He had been waiting. The message informing me of the meeting had never reached me. I read the sentence 3 times before I fully understood it. Then came the next line. I later learned that Diane handled the communication herself. My heart sank. A memory surfaced immediately. I remembered feeling hurt and confused when Dad never contacted me again about the discussion. For years I assumed he simply changed his plans. Now I discovered that assumption may have been built on a lie. I continued reading through tears. My mother never accused Diane directly of malicious intent. In fact, she carefully avoided harsh judgments. But she admitted that too many situations over the years shared the same pattern. Information passed through Diane. Conversations changed. Details disappeared. Misunderstandings followed. By the time I reached the final page, I felt emotionally exhausted. Then I noticed an attachment clipped behind the letter. It was a photocopy of a handwritten note from my father. The note was dated just weeks before his death. At the bottom, He had written a sentence that made everything suddenly feel much larger than inheritance or paperwork. Both my daughters deserve the truth, especially Evelyn, because she never received the full story. For a long time, I sat at the kitchen table holding my father's note. Outside, the rain had stopped. Evening sunlight filtered through the windows and cast long shadows across the room. Yet I barely noticed. My attention remained fixed on a single sentence. She never received the full story. I thought about all the years that had passed since my father died. The birthdays, the holidays, the family gatherings where Diane always seemed to take charge of every conversation involving family history. I had trusted her completely, not because she earned that trust every day, but because she was my sister. Trust had been automatic, unquestioned. Now I wondered how many important moments had been shaped by information I never received. The following morning, I called Grace and asked her to come to the farmhouse. When she arrived, I showed her the letter and my father's note. She read every page carefully. By the time she finished, her expression had changed. "This explains so much," she said quietly. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated before answering. Then she pulled out her phone and opened several photographs she had taken while helping my mother organize paperwork the previous year. Most were ordinary records. Then she stopped on one image. My breath caught immediately. The photograph showed a page from a family planning binder. Across the top, my mother had written a list of people she wanted present at a future family meeting. My name appeared first. Diane's appeared second. Underneath were several grandchildren, including Grace. "Grandma talked about this meeting a lot," Grace said. "She wanted everyone together. Did it ever happen?" I asked. Grace slowly shook her head. "No." A few days before the date, Diane told everyone it had been canceled because Grandma was tired. I closed my eyes. Another canceled meeting. Another message delivered through Diane. Another opportunity that disappeared before anyone could verify the truth. By that afternoon, a decision had formed in my mind. I no longer wanted answers only for myself. Too many family members had been affected by years of confusion and missing information. If the truth existed, everyone deserved to hear it together. I contacted Michael Thornton and arranged a meeting for the following weekend. Then I called several relatives, explaining that I had discovered important documents connected to Mom's estate and Dad's final wishes. Most agreed to attend immediately. A few sounded nervous. Word travels quickly in families. By evening, nearly everyone had confirmed. Only one person reacted differently: Diane. Her call came just before sunset. I stared at her name on the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello, Diane." Silence lingered for a moment. Then her voice came through. "Calm. Careful. I heard you have been going through Mother's papers." "Yes." Another pause. "Some things are better left in the past, Evelyn." I looked toward the farmhouse window where the last sunlight was fading beyond the fields. "Maybe," I replied. But some things were never supposed to be hidden. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Diane sighed. It sounded tired, almost defeated. Then she said something that sent a chill through me. "If you keep digging, you are going to uncover far more than you think." The family gathering took place the following Saturday at the community room of our church. It was the same place where we had celebrated anniversaries, retirement parties, and holiday dinners for years. By noon, nearly every relative had arrived. Conversations were polite but cautious. Everyone sensed something important was about to happen. I sat near the front beside Grace and Michael Thornton. On the table before us rested several folders, copies of letters, and documents collected over the previous week. Diane arrived last. She walked into the room with the same calm expression she always carried. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us looked away. Once everyone had taken their seats, Michael stood and addressed the room. He explained that certain family records had recently been discovered and that those records provided important context regarding decisions made over many years. No accusations, no dramatic speeches, just facts. One by one, the documents were shared. First came my mother's notes regarding missing files and canceled appointments. Then came records showing repeated efforts to arrange family meetings that never occurred. After that, Michael presented copies of letters discussing equal treatment for both daughters and the importance of transparency. The room remained silent. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. Others lowered their eyes toward the documents in front of them. Then Michael handed out copies of my father's note. The same note I had read days earlier in the farmhouse kitchen. As family members studied the page, the atmosphere changed. People began connecting memories of their own. Forgotten conversations, canceled gatherings, explanations that never quite made sense. Finally, Michael turned toward Diane. "Would you like to respond to any of this?" he asked gently. For the first time all afternoon, Diane seemed uncertain. She looked around the room slowly. At the photographs, the letters, the faces of children and grandchildren who had trusted her for decades. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. She admitted that she often inserted herself into family matters because she believed she knew what was best. She admitted withholding information at times to avoid conflict. She admitted making decisions on behalf of others without always consulting them first. What she did not admit was intentional harm. Perhaps she truly believed she had been helping. Perhaps she had convinced herself that controlling information was the same as protecting people. But the effect had been the same. Trust had slowly disappeared. Relationships had been shaped by incomplete truths. Opportunities for honest conversations had been lost forever. No one shouted. No one argued. The disappointment in the room was far more powerful than anger. After several minutes, Diane lowered her eyes and said she was sorry. It was the first apology I could remember hearing from her. Yet even as the words left her mouth, I understood something important. Apologies can acknowledge the past, but they cannot rewrite it. The meeting ended quietly. Families gathered their papers and prepared to leave. Some relatives hugged me. Others simply nodded before walking away deep in thought. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, I felt neither victorious nor relieved. I felt sad, not because the truth had been revealed, but because it had taken so many years to reach it. Behind me, the church doors opened and closed as family members departed. Ahead of me stretched an uncertain future. I took a slow breath and looked toward the sky. My sister had not shattered our family in a single moment. The damage came one hidden truth at a time. And now, at last, everyone understood.